I think you have one foot out the door. You're looking at where the future is going to take you and that you can't do this forever. And I think that's a very dangerous place to be. The reality of your skill set, where you at now, I don't see you beating the elite guys.
The reception for Joe Rogan's latest stand-up special hasn't been great. This is a show 6 years in the making, and Rogan decided to do this special live. I watched it and I wanted to like it. I went in about as open-minded as I could. There was a few jokes that made me crack a smile and one that genuinely made me laugh. But to be honest, I couldn't get into it. I like Joe Rogan. He came up in the same era as a bunch of my other favorite comics. Dave Chappelle, Louis C.K., Patrice O'Neal, Hannah Gadsby, Bill Burr, Doug Stanhope, and so on. I wanted to make sure you were paying attention and didn't click off the video, you dopamine-deprived screen junkie. When I watched this special, I felt like a lot of the material was dated, and I wonder if he's been sitting on some of it for 6 years. He had a "did you just assume my gender" joke, which is a joke we as normies were all telling over half a decade ago, and eventually it became a meme.
What are you doing? Bro? Did you just assume my gender?
There were also jokes about offensive words and how when we use them, we never direct them towards marginalized groups. Instead, we use them as hyperbolic insults. This is a premise that was done by Louis C.K. back in 2008. I remember laughing so hard I was wiping away tears when I heard him tell this joke. It was the opener to his special Chewed Up, and here I am listening to a different rendition of it in 2024, and so many comics have done it that at this point it's just hack material. I just expected such a seasoned comic like Joe to give us something fresh or at least put a different spin on it. Again, it just felt dated. Rogan also tends to yell during most of the show, and I'm convinced it's something he adopted from his favorite stand-up comic, Sam Kinison.
And he goes, come on!
If you've ever watched Sam Kinison and have heard Joe's praise towards his style of comedy, it's not hard to see that Kinison had a major influence on Joe.
It was the first time that I ever thought that I could be a comedian. Not because I was like as good as him or anything like that. What it made me realize is like, oh, that's comedy too.
Is he your favorite?
He's my favorite.
I know Rogan has a massive fan base that loves his comedy, and I appreciate his dedication to the craft, but this just wasn't funny. I know that's not really saying much because comedy is so subjective. It's about as subjective as music. I remember a comedian saying that comedy kind of gets lumped together, which is odd when you compare it to other art forms that get separated by genre. In fact, I'm going to say something that is considered comedy blasphemy. Please don't keyboard kill me. I've never found George Carlin funny.
This guy is fucking stupid.
I know. This is the same reaction I have when people tell me they don't like the movie Goodfellas. I get it. Listen, I thought he was a brilliant performer with great stage presence and one of the most gifted orators in the history of public speaking. I enjoyed watching him. In fact, Carlin has this bit about ethnic pride where he says that pride should be reserved for something that you achieved and not something that happens by accident at birth. That bit has stuck with me till this very day. He just never really made me laugh, and it's not because he was before my time, because I thought Richard Pryor was hilarious, and I still find him funny till this day. I'm just trying to point out how subjective comedy can be, and that it wouldn't really be fair to say Joe Rogan isn't funny when I just revealed that I don't know shit about comedy because of that god-awful George Carlin take. I'm trying to give Rogan the benefit of the doubt here because overall I like the guy. But how could I claim to like the guy if I'm sitting here being critical of his comedy? Because there's more to Joe Rogan than just being a comedian. And as a longtime UFC fan, I first came to know him as Joe Rogan, the martial artist, commentator. It's my belief that as much as Rogan professes his love for comedy, the process he goes through, and his commitment for honing his craft, his true passion seems to be martial arts. Joe Rogan has been practicing martial arts longer than he's been doing comedy. And sure, there's nothing wrong with having multiple interests. I certainly do, which is why I could never land on an official niche for this channel. But martial arts Joe Rogan just seems to be at home in his natural habitat when practicing martial arts or discussing it. Some might disagree, but I find his commentary and his opinions insightful, even if and when he shows any bias. Sometimes unapologetic, in-your-face bias. Despite that, Joe Rogan has a legitimate background in martial arts. He was a 4-time Taekwondo champion in Massachusetts. He has a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and most importantly of all, Rogan has a 92% chance of beating Cenk Uygur in a fight.
I think I got an 8% chance of beating Rogan.
Yeah, you're
Nuts.
lost.
I know.
And a 100% chance of beating Blade.
Really fast, Joe Rogan. What's going on with the fight with Wesley Snipes?
He backed out of it.
A lot of feedback on that.
I don't know.
Whether he's a good commentator or not, like everything, including his comedy, is completely up to you. What's important is that Joe Rogan helped put UFC on the map. Rogan started his UFC career in 1997 as a post-fight interviewer, one of the many hats he wears to this day. He's been memed to death the last few years for interviewing fighters fresh off a knockout, but admittedly has come to the realization that is probably not the best practice. Anyway, back then there just wasn't a lot of money in doing these interviews, and Rogan eventually gave it up to pursue the more lucrative venture of working weekends at comedy clubs. However, in 2002, Joe Rogan's brother in baldness, Dana White, was eventually able to convince Rogan to do commentary at UFC 37.5, and the rest is history. And by history, I mean helping the UFC become a conglomerate in the world of sports. So much so that the average person, or casuals as they're referred to by virgins who've memorized every single fight in the history of combat sports, uses UFC and MMA synonymously. We've all heard someone say something along the lines of, yeah, I have a friend that does UFC. That's like saying I have a friend that does NFL. It doesn't make any sense. But that's less of a knock on the people who use UFC and MMA interchangeably, and more of a praise to the marketing efforts and empire that the UFC's built over the last couple of decades. And make no mistake, Joe Rogan had a huge hand in that. Most people watching this video are probably very well aware that Joe Rogan hosted a very popular show on NBC called Fear Factor. Fear Factor originally aired about a year before Rogan made his official debut as a UFC commentator, and the popularity of the show gave the UFC a lot of credibility and exposure. It was really a win-win-win situation for everyone involved. Fear Factor, UFC, and Joe Rogan's comedy career were all growing in unison. That is until 2006, when the original Fear Factor came to an end. After that, Rogan decided that he was going to dedicate more of himself to comedy. I know most people probably know Joe Rogan from his podcast, and I promise we'll get to that in a second. But in between Fear Factor ending and the Joe Rogan podcast starting, there's a very important moment in the history of stand-up comedy that happened in 2007, and I just can't fully tell the story of Joe Rogan's career without mentioning the incident at the Comedy Store. Enter Carlos Mencia. Every hero needs a villain. And because Joe Rogan is admittedly the hero in his own story, as we all are, the villain in Joe Rogan's comedy arc, the Joker to his Batman, the face of comedy evil, is that of Ned. That's right, his real name is Ned, and he got the name Carlos from Mitzi Shore, who ran the legendary Comedy Store, in order to appeal to Mexican audiences, and Mencia ran with that gimmick like a WWE wrestler. Mencia was a rising star in the early 2000s, and in 2005, Comedy Central greenlit Mind of Mencia. This was a half-hour show on Comedy Central, similar to Chappelle's Show, or for those of you who weren't around back then, you might be more familiar with Key and Peele. Back in 2005, having a show on Comedy Central was kind of a big deal. Carlos Mencia was a household name in comedy, but there was a giant underlying issue. You see, Carlos Mencia was a joke thief.
Listen to me, and look at me when I tell you this with all honesty. If you think that I steal jokes, yeah, you're right.
All the comics knew it, but no one said anything.
If anything you say is even remotely funny, I'm gonna make it mine. And all I'm gonna do is say Mexican in the front. I'm like a rapper. I just sample shit and make it my own. Was that really my song? I don't know. But it sounds like mine, but it kind of sounds like somebody else's. It's a hit, bitch!
That was until the infamous 2007 Comedy Store incident where Joe Rogan confronted Mencia on stage for everyone to see. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment occurrence. Actually, Joe Rogan had been publicly accusing Carlos Mencia of joke theft since 2005 when he wrote a blog post about it on his website. In this blog post, Rogan talks about Mencia's Mexican grift because it turns out Carlos Mencia is actually Honduran. Joe goes on and completely rips Mencia apart and accuses him of stealing material from Paul Mooney, Dave Chappelle, Richard Pryor, even Jeff Foxworthy. Things finally boiled over at the Comedy Store on February 10th, 2007. Rogan is on stage and starts going back and forth with Mencia, but you can't really decipher what he's saying because Mencia is the one with the mic and is talking over Rogan, denying all of the accusations. The crowd seems confused, and believe it or not, many of them are siding with Carlos Mencia because you have to keep in mind, he's a star at this point. He repeatedly calls Joe Rogan a little bitch, which might seem wild given the martial arts history I just went over, but it's possible Mencia wasn't privy to this information. It doesn't matter. In either case, it seems like he was trying to bait Rogan into a fight because if he's successful, it'll A, get Joe to stop talking about these accusations that Mencia knows are true, and B, it kind of kills the story's credibility. Rogan keeps his cool and continues with his goal of exposing Carlos Mencia as a joke thief. However, it's barely audible. But everything starts to shift when some unsuspecting hero's arm emerges from the shadows and hands Joe Rogan a microphone. Suddenly, Rogan starts to win over the crowd, and when comedian Ari Shaffir comes on stage, he gives credibility to Rogan's accusations, recalling a time Mencia stole one of Ari Shaffir's jokes back when Shaffir used to open for Carlos Mencia. At this point, the crowd has completely turned on Carlos, and it's almost eerie that from this point forward, his career takes a downward trajectory that is never recovered from until this day. In essence, Joe Rogan had done to Carlos Mencia what 50 Cent did to Ja Rule just a few years prior.
Gives a fuck what Ja Rule thinks at a time like this, nigga. This is ridiculous.
Justice prevailed, and comedy was saved from the thieving mind of Mencia. But who was going to save comedy from Joe? And who was going to save Joe from comedy? More on that later. I mentioned how this incident took place sometime after Fear Factor, but before the Joe Rogan Podcast. Because had the podcast existed in all of its current popularity, Rogan could have destroyed Mencia's career right after an ad break. But alas, the Joe Rogan Experience hadn't yet materialized, and we wouldn't be witness to it until 2009, when we were introduced to Joe Rogan, the podcaster. This is probably my favorite version of Rogan, although admittedly, I'm not a frequent listener. The episodes are long, sometimes 2 or 3 hours, so I really only listen whenever there's a guest I find interesting. And I think Joe Rogan is a skilled interviewer. He has a unique style of interviewing people in a very conversational way. He's able to show empathy, listen attentively, and get a lot of his guests to feel comfortable enough to open up and just have a real conversation, instead of some curated interview with cherry-picked talking points that sound like they came from a publicist. Except for when he interviews some fake Hollywood sellout like The Rock, who's too scared to say something controversial and walks on eggshells every time he's in front of a camera, but that's a discussion for another day. Before becoming the biggest podcast on earth, the Joe Rogan Experience, which took its name from a Jimi Hendrix album, started from humble beginnings. Joe started the podcast with comedian and producer Brian Redband, which, fun fact, was the guy that filmed the Mencia Rogan incident at the Comedy Store. No shit. Rogan wasn't a stranger to radio-style banter. He, along with a slew of other comics, had been on the now-defunct Opie and Anthony show. Slowly but surely, the Joe Rogan Experience, or JRE for short, started to gain traction. The idea of having guests started with one of Rogan's closest friends, who we met a little earlier during the Mencia story, Ari Shaffir. Once again, Joe Rogan had the perfect recipe for exposure. The podcast and UFC commentary would prop up Rogan's stand-up. The success of each endeavor would compound the subsequent audiences, creating this unique crossover fan base that you could see reflected in the guests that were featured on the podcast. There were a lot of interesting people, and the more the show grew, the more prominent the guests became. But Rogan never made it exclusive to just already famous and successful people. Rogan just wanted to talk to people that he found interesting, even if they weren't considered mainstream. He'd become a modern version of Johnny Carson. Comedians were dying to get on his show so they could benefit from the Rogan bump. The Rogan bump wasn't just limited to comics, as we saw guys like Jordan Peterson and David Goggins rise to fame after appearing on the podcast, but it was definitely a place where a comic could go from being a club headliner to doing theaters. I personally saw this happen with comedian Andrew Schulz. I watched Andrew Schulz perform at the Comedy Zone just as he was getting some notoriety online, and shortly after that show, he was on the Joe Rogan Podcast and his career blew up. Today, Schulz, like a lot of comedians who are in Rogan's orbit, are massively successful. He's one of these comedians that I consider to be part of the Rogan sphere, a term we're going to come back to later in this video. The Joe Rogan Experience had gotten so big that by 2020, Spotify, who was looking to carve out their name in the world of podcasts, signed him to an exclusive $200 million deal. Joe Rogan, who was already wealthy, now officially had money. And the controversy started right away with Rogan's views on the vaccine, which is part of a bit from his new special, and artists threatening to remove their music from Spotify if they didn't agree to remove Joe from the platform. But Spotify decided to stick with Rogan, and artists like Neil Young, who pulled his catalog of music from the streaming service, eventually came back, just like I did when I ran away from home at 6 years old, only to find out the backyard was about as far as I was gonna make it. My parents' comfy home with air conditioning, food, and a bed to lay in had me by the balls, and they hadn't even dropped yet. I was trapped. I didn't have the resources to just pack up and move to Austin, Texas, like Joe Rogan did in 2020 when he decided to escape California's COVID restrictions and even open up his own comedy club in 2022, the Comedy Mothership, the very same venue where his live performance of Burn the Boats took place. We've finally come full circle and need to talk about Joe Rogan, the comedian. Rogan has been performing stand-up since the late 80s, getting his start in Boston. The comics I mentioned at the start of this video are also from Boston, along with a slew of other comedians. His rise to fame has made him one of the biggest comics on the planet. But what separates Joe from his counterparts is he didn't get famous from comedy. He became famous from television, UFC, and getting in early on a now saturated world of podcasting. This formula was then passed down to those who belong to what's known in the comedy world as the Rogan sphere. I was mildly aware of this, but after researching this video, I found out there was a ton of content about the world of stand-up comedians and their respective podcasts. Some of the more well-known content creators are Too Lazy to Try, Comedy Enforcement, Podcast Cringe, and a few others. So if you're into that world, those are the channels to get the latest information from. One of the stories that caught my attention was a disagreement between comedians Bert Kreischer and Marc Maron. Maron made a comment about Netflix throwing money at talentless comedians who show up drunk, rant on stage, not really making any jokes, and are basically on a cash grab tour. Everyone figured he was talking about Bert, including Joe Rogan. Bert is one of these comics connected to the Rogan sphere, and it was actually Rogan himself who let Bert know what Maron said. The funny thing is, Mark Maron wasn't talking about Bert Kreischer.
I called Bert.
Yeah.
And I'm like, dude, I wasn't talking about you.
Wow.
I said, you don't do pop-up shows.
Yeah.
I was talking about Dave.
It was interesting, though, that Rogan initially believed he was talking about Bert, and it makes me think if he had a Freudian slip, because the opinion of Bert being a talentless drunk who's made a ton of money from Netflix is shared among many in the stand-up and comedy podcast fan base. And it's not just Bert, as Cat Williams put it.
Joe got 6 comedians that never been funny he want to push out.
No one has more influence in the world of comedy than Joe Rogan. I mentioned Andrew Schultz earlier, but there's a whole network of comics who've seen their careers explode simply from their connection to Rogan. Some of these comedians are great, and some aren't. I'll let you decide which is which. The point is, Rogan's cronies have an overpowering presence in the comedy world in the same way Disney dominates the film industry. Rogan rid the world of Carlos Mencia only to give us Brennan Schaub. He was the one who pushed Schaub into comedy, and it's interesting because Schaub is the type of comedian that other comics tend to hate. Someone who didn't pay their dues and went straight to the top. But it's because of Schaub's relationship with Rogan, no one really says anything because no one wants to upset the master. Not that Rogan is some kind of evil tyrant. By all accounts, he seems pretty down to earth. But the last place you want to be as a stand-up comic is on Rogan's bad side. Again, not that he'd come after anyone, but no one wants to fracture their relationship with Joe Rogan and kill their chances at exposure. This apprehensiveness of being ostracized from the Rogan sphere, I believe, is hindering Rogan's career. It reminds me of the story of King Lear by Shakespeare. In the story, King Lear has 3 daughters and wants to leave his kingdom to whoever claims to love him the most. 2 of his daughters show him insincere love and fake flattery and tell the king everything he wants to hear. In the end, King Lear's inability to see this leads to his downfall. Like King Lear, Rogan either can't see through the fake flattery or doesn't care that it's fake as long as it seems real. He doesn't have anyone to sit him down the way he sat down Brandon Schaub in an act of tough love where Rogan told Schaub that he just didn't have what it takes to reach the highest levels of MMA and that he should put his focus elsewhere. But even if someone were to tell Rogan this, there's really no reason for him to listen. As far as comedy goes, Rogan has the ability to draw huge crowds. Again, through fame that was garnered through means other than comedy. And because of that, I think he's all in on stand-up and has decided to burn the boats.